Hi, I'm Old Norse specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford. Over a long career of studying many ancient languages, especially in grad school and thereafter, more than 2 dozen formally, and teaching those languages, especially Old Norse, I have been very frequently in the position where I have to teach a lot of English vocabulary before I can begin teaching you anything about these languages because there's so much technical detail about the grammar of these languages that we can only express in kind of technical linguistic jargon in English. And so often in these classes, the very first lecture or the first week of lectures really would be best suited in being a lecture about that sort of English meta language of linguistics. So what I'm going to try to do in this video, and this may be stitched together over a few days if I continue to add vocabulary to it, is talk about the meta language, the language that we need to talk about language in English. This isn't just for Old Norse students, although I clearly am going to have my Old Norse students foremost in my mind and thinking about this, because they're the people that I usually have to explain this stuff to. So let's start with verbs. That isn't conventionally how grammar books start, but if you don't understand what the verb is doing in the sentence, you're not going to understand what any of the substantives or nouns, we'll get back to some of that vocabulary, are doing either. So what is a verb to start with? I mean, very often people don't have actually a particularly clear idea about this. It's conventional at this point for me to blame the state of teaching, but I've known a lot of teachers who try pretty hard to teach this stuff and are just working with very low motivations on the part of everybody else involved, not just students, but also often the parents and administrators. So, you know, it's easy to blame the teachers, but as a whole, as a culture, we don't really care about this stuff anymore, right? English speakers generally don't need to learn a language other than English, and so teaching anything even about English seems less and less necessary to people, I think, because, well, you speak English already, don't you? But that doesn't necessarily mean that just because you swim in that water that you understand very much about the water. And actually learning more about other languages can make you much more aware of how English works. So a lot of what I'm going to say and a lot of this vocabulary applies as much to English as to any other language. It's just that ancient Indo-European languages like the ones that I'm mostly concerned with, languages like Old Norse or Greek or Latin, or modern languages that have a similar structure like Russian or a lot of the other Slavic languages, uh, they will mark certain concepts differently, but conceptually the same ideas will still apply to English. So again, let's start with verbs. So some of the what is a verb? A verb is a word that will fit into the blank in the sentence. The bee blanks around the tree. Now it will fit grammatically, but maybe not, form a coherent thought. So the bee flies around the tree. Okay, that's easy. The bee lives around the tree, I guess. The bee fights around the tree. The bee eats around the tree. The bee drinks around the tree. The bee studies around the tree, whatever. You may not have a good picture in your head of what this means. What does it look like for a bee to study? But if a word can fit in that blank, it's a verb. And in English, our verbs are relatively uncomplicated, except for the fairly different ways that they may form their past tense. So in English, we have really, except for one verb, just two forms in the present tense of any given verb. So let's take the verb run. I run, you run, we run, they run. We still use the same form that you'd find in the dictionary. That dictionary form, by the way, the form that follows to, if we talk about I like to blank, that's called the infinitive. So that's your, uh, it's, let's start off by calling it the form that you will find of the verb in the dictionary. Now, the form, however, that you will use after the third person singular, the he, she, or it subject, or a named subject, it might be Jackson or the man or the raven or something like that. In English, we add an S there. So instead of Jackson run, the man run, the raven run, it's Jackson runs, the man runs, the raven runs. And this is the only complexity in most verbs in English. But other languages can have much more complexity. English speakers are often familiar with the more complex system in Spanish, for example. So a verb's subject can be divided into a first person, a second person, or a third person, which just mean first person includes the speaker. So first person singular is I, first person plural is we. Second person is the person that the speaker is speaking to, so it's you. Now, in formal conventional English, you is singular and plural, but lots of dialects have innovated different words for a plural you. So spreading in the southern and rural U.S. more generally is y'all, is a plural you. You also hear you guys, yens, yous, etc., etc. But for written English, we can really just talk about you in the singular and the plural. And then there's third person, which is neither the speaker nor the person the speaker is talking to. It's somebody else. So we may have third person singular. That may be he, she, it. It may be a particular described person with just a common noun. Again, something like, a man, a tree. Or it may be a named individual, Jackson, Lauren, whatever. And then third person plural, the pronoun is they. Or we may have a named noun or a named person. Again, we may have, trees or people or Jackson and Lauren or something like that. So that's our first, second, third person, and that's our singular and plural. And in English, this makes very, very little difference about the shape of the verb. In a language like Spanish, again, it does, right? Amo, amas, ama. That would be I love, you love, he, she, or it loves. The verb itself carries that information about the person who's the subject. English no longer does that, but ancient Indo-European languages like Old Norse do. So we need to keep that in mind. All right, so we have the person, which is the only thing that makes English inflect the verb in the present tense. And then we have tense itself. So in the present tense, we're talking about what's going on right now or what goes on generally. In fact, in English, the present tense is much, the conventional present tense, I run, you run, he runs, is used much more often of talking about what happens generally than about what is happening in the moment. So I run sounds like, I'm a person who runs regularly, right? I do this often. In English, we have actually split off for the most part, talking about, in the moment by using a progressive here where we say not I run, but I am running, right? That means like at this moment, I'm going up and down the road running. Spanish actually does something very similar. That uses the present participle. So in English, that ends in ing, at least in the written language. For most speakers, it ends in, right? I am running. But written, I am running. And that is the present participle, and I'll come back to participles a little bit more. But the present tense, he runs, and the past tense, he ran, are the only inflected forms of verbal tense in English. Now, what do I mean by inflected? Anytime that I am changing the sound or the written picture of a word, I am inflecting it. So, man to plural men, that's an inflection. Dog to plural dogs, that's an inflection. I run, he runs, that's an inflection. I run right now, I ran yesterday, that's an inflection. Anything that changes the word. So in English, we actually only inflect the present and past. I run, past tense, I ran. Some verbs have an inflected past participle that you use with have. So I sang, past tense, but I have sung. That's certainly in a conventional ancient Indo-European sense, that's inflecting the verb I don't know if most speakers necessarily think of it that way for English, but we can call that an inflection too. At any rate, it's not a straightforward tense, it's a participle, and I'll come back to participles. Now we have other tenses. So in English, we have the present tense for present time or general time. We have the past tense for time before us. We also have a future tense. We have various other constructed tenses, the so-called perfect. I'll talk about this in just a moment. But these aren't created by inflecting the verb per se, or that's not the major signal of what the tense is. So our future tense doesn't involve any inflection, right? We just say will or going to. So I will run, or I'm going to run. That makes it future, right? We don't change run. Now, in some languages, again, familiar Romance languages do this. Certainly, ancient Indo-European languages often do this. Instead of will run, instead of having this modal verb will that's attached to the infinitive of the verb that we want to talk about the action of, we actually change the verb. We inflect the verb to show that we're talking about the future, but English doesn't ever do that. But you can perhaps by now conceptually see how that might work, where there would be run, present, ran, past, and, reen, meaning will run, future. A lot of languages do work like that. And all of our other tenses are constructed, are compound tenses as well. So, for example, we have the so-called perfect tense. Perfect does not mean, extraordinarily good. It means complete. The action is complete. The action is already done. So, I have, and then past participle, I have done something. Now, that perfect tense is formed with that past participle plus the verb have and the appropriate tense. And the past participle varies quite a bit between different verbs in English. So most verbs, the past participle is going to be just the same as the past tense. I walked past. I have walked with in the perfect tense with the past participle. I recorded past tense. I have recorded, using the past participle with the verb have to make a perfect tense. Some verbs do have distinct past participles. These will typically be the verbs that don't form their past tense with a suffix, but the verbs that form their past tense by changing their root vowel. Sing in the present, sang in the past, sung is the past participle. I sing today, I sang yesterday, I have sung every day this year, right? So sung is that past participle that's being used with have. So what is a participle? This is a good time to address this word. A participle is a form derived, it's a word derived from a verb that can be used either to make a perfect tense or to be used adjectively. In English, typically we don't use past participles adjectively without some kind of indication of quality or frequency on them. So, for example, I mentioned sung as the past participle of sing. So we could say, well, this is a sung hymn, but that sounds odd. We would much more likely say, well, this is a very well sung hymn, right? There's some notion of quality there, or this is a very poorly sung hymn, or so again, quality, or then frequency. This is an often sung hymn on Sundays, or this is a seldom sung hymn on Sundays. Those indications of quality or frequency seem sort of necessary for us to use past participles as adjectives most of the time in English. Past participles are also used with the past tense of have to make what's called the so-called pluperfect or past perfect tense. This means not only is the action complete, but it was complete in a fairly remote time. So not I have sung, I might have sung yesterday, but I had sung, right? It's much more over than something that's just perfect. And then, although most speakers won't use them in conversation, we have a future perfect tense. I will have sung, right? So by Sunday, I will have sung the song, or by Sunday, I will have learned the terms in this video, or something like that. All right. that's at least an elementary look at tenses. By the way, in dealing with ancient Germanic languages specifically, like Old Norse or Old English, you also have only two inflected tenses, present and past. So, for example, Old Norse, ek verð, I become, ek varð, I became. And then you have a past participle that's used with the verb have to make a perfect tense. Ek hevi orðið, I have become. And then you have a separate verb that's used with the infinitive to make the future tense. Ek mun verða in Old Norse, I will become. So very much like English in that way. Where you really get into massive amounts of different tenses is in a language like Greek or Sanskrit, to a somewhat lesser degree with Latin, where you have just every tense is inflected one way or another. And in Romance languages still maintain some of that complexity too, usually. This is as good a place as any for me to throw in a quick word from my friends and partners at Grimfrost. So let me do that, and I'll be right back to talk about some more grammatical terminology. So as I said, all of this terminology conceptually applies to English. We can have a future perfect tense. I will have sung the song by Sunday. I will have learned the terms by Sunday. And you can conceive, I hope, of how a language might express that, not by piling up words like English does, I will have sung, but by having a distinct form of sing that means I will have sung. Now, often our ancient Indo-European languages, as well as I shouldn't give short shrift to surviving Indo-European languages that have a lot of this complexity still built into them. They haven't lost it like English has. Icelandic maintains most of the complexity of Old Norse. Most of the Slavic languages maintain a lot of this complexity too. Lithuanian certainly maintains a lot of this complexity. So I don't want to make it sound like this is just something that's in the past, although it's in the past for English. And it's typically very conceptually weird for English speakers at first. But you can conceive of how a verb like sing, which has 6 forms potentially in the present tense, right? First person singular I, second person singular you, third person singular he, she, it, first person plural we, second person plural you guys, third person plural they. You can conceive of how sing might have 6 different forms, even if you've never heard of a language that does that. Spanish does, and a lot of people are familiar with that. Canto, cantas, canta, cantamos. But English doesn't. Now, take those 6 forms in the present and then multiply them to a language that might have 6 forms in the past, 6 forms in the future, 6 forms in the perfect, 6 forms in the pluperfect, past perfect, 6 forms in the future perfect, 6 forms in the imperfect, which is roughly equivalent. Some languages have a distinct imperfect, which is roughly equivalent to English. I was doing it, but actually as if there was a form of do that meant I was doing. You can even have 6 forms in, there's a lot of potential tenses out there, especially with the past. I mean, Greek and Sanskrit have this tense called the aorist, which is very difficult to relate actually to any concept of time. It's almost the tense where time doesn't matter, and Greek and Sanskrit people are going to jump down my throats. I've studied Greek and Sanskrit too. I'm trying to explain this for people that probably aren't going to study it, but if they are at the very beginning of it. But you can then see how a language might wind up having dozens of verb forms, whereas English has very few, right? We have an infinitive, run, that's also the present form, except for the third person singular, which is runs. Past tense, ran. Past participle, usually the same as the past tense, ran. Present participle, running. And by that point, you've basically run out of the forms in English. Other languages may have much, much, much more complexity. There's also some vocabulary we can use in talking about the differences between verbs and what they mean. One of the most critical differences between verbs as vocabulary items is what verbs are intransitive versus transitive. One of the best verbs for demonstrating the difference between this, which English is not very sensitive to, but some languages are super sensitive to, is the verb burn. So in English, um, if you ask me what I'm doing, and I say I'm burning, you would infer that the fact that I'm answering you calmly means that I have, a fire pit going, and I have some fuel in it, and I'm adding whatever it is that I'm burning. However, it is ambiguous because it could in fact mean I myself am on fire, right? What are you doing? I'm burning. It could mean I'm on fire. This kind of sounds like a conversation that I have in one of the dumber Marvel movies. In a lot of languages, that transitive intransitive difference really matters, and so you're going to have a different verb that means I'm burning, I'm on fire, versus I'm burning some stuff. So I'm burning, I'm on fire. That's intransitive. I'm burning some stuff. That's transitive. Intransitive means that the subject is experiencing something, right? The verb is experiential rather than a verb of action. Something is being done. Another good example of this is with the verb break, right? So, for instance, I could say, and again, English speakers are used to just tuning into the context here and guessing what it means, but it's still technically ambiguous. I could say, my heart is breaking. And you would infer, just based on context and frequency and what people are usually talking about, that I mean that, my heart is hurt and is, it's splitting, it's hurting, I'm feeling mournful and sad. But it could mean, without that context clue, my heart is chopping wood and breaking it apart. So my heart is breaking, I'm sad, that's intransitive. My heart is breaking timber. If heart could do that, that would be transitive. Again, some languages are very sensitive about this, and in teaching Old Norse, for example, we have a difference between an intransitive verb, to burn, and a transitive verb, to burn. We have a difference between an intransitive verb, to break, and a transitive verb, to break. We have a difference between an intransitive verb, to wake, right? I'm waking up. I'm the one who was asleep and is now getting awake, versus transitive, I'm waking somebody else up, right? Again, English doesn't really care about this distinction very much, and we usually judge based on context what people are doing. But some languages, Slavic languages too, can be very sensitive about this. Verbs have moods. So the typical mood is indicative. I am here. The tree is white. You are talking to me, right? Just talking about what's happening. But there's also a imperative mood that's a command. Get up. Shut up. Talk. Drive. Get in the chopper, right? That's a command. That's an imperative. Many languages have a distinct subjunctive. Now, the subjunctive can take over a lot of different functions that may actually have been different in an earlier stage of the language. They often are on the subjunctive of Germanic languages, but subjunctive generally indicates a little bit of a further remove from the truth. So something that somebody else said. So he says that you're coming tomorrow. Your coming tomorrow might be subjunctive because I don't know that. He says that as indicative, right? That's a fact. I know this guy says it. But you're coming tomorrow, this thing somebody else says, is subjunctive because I'm not as sure about it. So subjunctive is often used that way. It's also often used justively, meaning to indicate a wish but not a command, right? I'm sort of wishing a fate or God or the universe, as people like to say now, versus commanding anybody. So long live the king, right? Notice that's actually a rare survival of a jussive subjunctive in English. May the king live, right? I'm not commanding the king to live long, and I'm not saying the king lives long. I'm using this S-less third-person singular form to say, I hope he lives long. May he live long. Subjunctives may also indicate counterfactual statements. So in English, we still very residually have this distinction with was versus were. Same thing in Swedish with var versus vara. If I was rich, That sounds like maybe potentially I could be. If I were rich, that's the subjunctive form, the old subjunctive cognate with the subjunctive in Old Norse vari, modern Icelandic vairi. That's a remove from, that's counterfactual. Like I'm not rich, I'm not gonna be. It's much more unlikely because I have a PhD in Scandinavian studies. And sometimes in other languages, these are expressed as whole different categories. You might have a adjective category, you might have an optative category, the category hoping, you might have a counterfactual category. But in the languages that most of you who would be checking out this video would be studying, the subjunctive is a mood category that includes all of these different senses. Let's talk a little bit about nouns relative to verbs, right? Nouns need verbs to function, right? I like to tell students early on in Old Norse classes, if they haven't studied languages very seriously before, that the verb is the sun to the solar system of the clause. Now, it's important perhaps to define the term clause. We are not usually talking about sentences per se when we're in linguistic jargon. A sentence is a little bit of a artificial convention of writing, something that starts with a capital letter and ends with a period. A sentence begins with a capital letter. Capital letter is big, 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 right? Or however that earworm goes. In linguistics, typically we're more concerned with the clause, so that's going to be the verb and everything that is dependent on it and associated with that verb. So a sentence may have multiple clauses. Let me give you an example of one. This is one of the faults behind my approach everything without a script method, right? But I see a bear over there, and I'm going to go get it. Just the first thing that came to mind. So I see a bear over there is a clause, right? I'm the subject of see. Bear is the object of see. Over there gives a little bit more context and information about the bear and where it is. Then we have another clause joined to that clause by the conjunction and that clause is I'm going to go get it, right? So get is the verb, is kind of the son of this clause. It's I'm gonna I guess I'm gonna go put it on a leash like Audun in that one little short story from medieval Iceland. But that's a different clause. So we need to think of the verb as the sun to the solar system of the clause, and then the verb will have a subject, right? Something is doing the verb. So the verb indicates an action, chop, break, fight. It indicates an experience, feel, learn, see. It indicates potentially a state that's not exactly experienced. I stand, I sit, I am. So what is the subject? What is doing it? What is experiencing it? What is in that state? Well, that's the subject. All right. Now, the subject in most languages that I've ever had to teach, we have to make some pretty careful distinctions here because the subject is usually in what we call the nominative case. Now, cases are the biggest, toughest part of an old Indo-European language, or again, complex modern Indo-European language to teach. A case is a form of a noun in which it is inflected, remember changed, in order to reflect its relationship typically to the verb, but potentially to other nouns in the sentence or to prepositions. Get back to prepositions. Now, English vestigially has some distinctions of case. Old English still had 5 cases. 4 robustly and a 5th in adjectives. And we still have remnants of 3. One case that English speakers usually have no problem understanding is the genitive case. Our modern English genitive case has an inflection, S. We spell it with an apostrophe S. The apostrophe has no real historical justification. But the S that we add to show that something possesses something else, that is putting it into the genitive case. That is inflecting that noun for the genitive. So, microphone. Jackson's microphone. That's putting Jackson in the genitive. A wing. Well, a raven's wing. Ravens is putting raven in the genitive case. So we're used to doing that inflection. That case is familiar to English speakers. And in pronouns, we have a little bit of experience distinguishing between a nominative and what's really a vestigial dative, but I'll call it accusative for simplicity's sake. So I versus me is nominative versus accusative. I have an idea. I is the nominative form of the first person personal pronoun, the pronoun that describes the person speaking, as the one person speaking. But I have an idea. Notice it's different if I say, you saw me. Me and I, those are the same person. But I can't say you saw I, and I can't say me has an idea, right? English has to inflect I in the nominative when it's the subject. I have an idea, I see you. But in the accusative, if it's the object, that's me. So you see me, or, and this is going to be another vestigial dative, but you told me your idea. So the thing to realize is that in a language like Old Norse or Old English, or indeed in modern languages like Russian and German, there is a difference in most nouns between the nominative and the accusative. Man is not the same if a man sees a bear versus a bear sees a man, right? We actually have to change the word man. So in Old Norse, maður ser björn, a man sees a bear. But if I say man ser björn, I'm using man in the accusative, and even though I haven't changed the word order because now man is in its object form, that means the bear sees the man. Most old and modern inflected Indo-European languages are going to work like that. Oddly, I chose Bjorn, which is the same in nominative and accusative in that example. So what are some of the other cases that we might encounter in a language like Old Norse? Well, Old Norse, and for the most part Old English, and then other Germanic languages like Gothic or Old Frisian have, or German, have 4 cases: nominative, accusative, genitive, and dative. So nominative, again, is the subject. I see a bear. The man sees a bear. Accusative is the direct object, the noun or pronoun that is, if you will, receiving the brunt of the action of the verb. So the bear sees me, me is accusative. Or the bear sees a man, man is accusative. It has nothing to do with accusing. Actually, this is one of the biggest confusions that I see in people early on when they're learning an inflected language is they think accusative must mean the subject because it's the person you're accusing of doing the action. I wish it made that much sense. Nominative, actually, I mean, it's from Latin, right? Nominat it's nominative is just the naming case. It's the case for just, it's the default case and the case for the subject. Accusative is the one that is subjected to, j'accuse the person in accusative. I accuse the person in accusative, if you will. It doesn't make great logical sense if you want to use it as an extension of the English word accuse. It is the direct object. Now, there's also indirect objects. So lots of verbs have direct objects. I give gifts. Gifts is a direct object. It's accusative. I tell stories. Stories is a direct object. It's accusative. But if we add someone who receives an action rather than is affected by the action, I give you gifts. Gifts is a direct object. It's accusative. You is an indirect object. It's dative. Likewise, I tell people stories. Stories is accusative. That's what I tell. What do I tell? I tell stories. That's accusative, direct object. But who do I tell it to? That's dative. That's an indirect object. That's people. So many languages, and certainly many Germanic languages and Old English itself distinguish between a dative and an accusative. You'll see more accusatives than datives, but dative is still quite common, and many prepositions take a dative object in languages like Old English, Old Norse, and German. Now, to quickly mention what a preposition is, I mentioned that you could say anything that fits in the space, a bee blanks around a tree, that's a verb. Well, anything that fits in the space grammatically, not necessarily as a cogent logical story, the bee flies blank the tree, that's a preposition. So the bee flies around the tree, in the tree, on the tree, over the tree, under the tree. Yes, I know logically under the tree doesn't make sense, but again, grammatically it makes sense. So that's a preposition. It is a word that does not inflect itself, except in Celtic languages, I guess. The prepositions don't inflect, but they indicate a typically spatial, sometimes time relation between nouns and other nouns, or between an action and a noun. So a preposition will take an object, right, over the tree is the object, or about a girl, girl is the object of the preposition about. Most prepositions in Germanic languages, I think it's fair to say, take a dative object, so that the dative is both the case of I give you gifts, you being the dative there, and the case of about you, around you, for you, that kind of thing. Now, I already mentioned the genitive. That's typically very easy to understand for English speakers. The genitive is the case of possession. So, a man's brain, man's is genitive. A raven's wing, raven's is genitive. In English, this is simple. We just add s. Actually, in present-day Scandinavian languages on the continent, Swedish, Danish, Norwegian, it's the same. You also just add an s. It's a characteristic of Germanic languages from a long time ago. Now, in Old Norse, by the way, for those who might be watching this from the Old Norse classes, there is a very unusual situation where the genitive is also the object of a very common preposition. When you go to something, if I walk up to the summit of that mountain, the summit is actually in genitive. I go to something in the genitive in Old Norse. Very, very weird thing, historically speaking, but that's not common in other languages. Now, other languages may have other cases. And different Indo-European languages will maintain different ones of these. But in Proto-Indo-European, the ancestor language of most languages of Europe, Iran, and India, about 5,000 years ago, we also have an ablative case. That's the case of the source of something. So the fish came from the water. Water would be ablative. We have an allative case. That's actually the case of direction to. I go to the summit. Summit would be allative. That's only well preserved in Anatolian languages like Hittite, the very earliest preserved Indo-European languages in writing. We have a vocative case. Actually, Gothic still maintains this of Germanic languages. This is the case for addressing someone. So if you come up to me and you say, Dr. Crawford, I have a question or a criticism, Dr. Crawford is in the vocative. And then there is an instrumental case, and actually Old English maintains this in adjectives, although not in nouns. And the instrumental case is I wrote a note with a pen. Pen is instrumental. I fought with a spear. Spear is instrumental. Now, I mentioned that Old English maintains an instrumental case in adjectives but not in nouns. Now, this is something that's critical to keep in mind with inflected languages, is that we have to have agreement. So the adjectives that are used to describe a particular noun have to agree with it. So if I have a nominative noun, a bear is walking over there, I have to use nominative adjectives. A black bear is walking over there. So that if I say, all right, a black bear is walking over there, that's nominative. The black bear is walking. But I see a black bear. Now black and bear are both accusative. They have to agree. So in Old Norse, this is actually kind of an interesting thing that Old Norse can demonstrate pretty well. A black bear walks over there. Svartur bjorn gengur þar. All right, svartur bjorn. Svartur is the adjective black in nominative, masculine singular. I'll get to the masculine and singular part, although I think singular is fairly logical, fairly understandable. But I see a black bear. Ek se svartan bjorn. Now, bear didn't change. Not all nouns are going to change between nominative and accusative, but even if the noun doesn't change, the adjective has to change. So I changed the adjective svartur nominative to svartan accusative, and you can still tell, since I'm talking about a bear, that goes with the bear. It is accusative, and I'm talking about a bear I saw. So adjectives have to agree with the noun that they describe in case, nominative, accusative, genitive, dative, and if applicable, ablative, allative, locative, instrumental, vocative, and they have to agree in number. So in many languages, you'll have a different form of the adjective in the accusative singular versus in the dative plural. And then they also have to agree in gender. Now, gender is a very amorphous concept in language in some ways, because it is not really typically that related to biological sex. Most of the time, languages that have gender, the word for man is masculine and the word for woman is feminine. As far as that goes, that's about as logical as it gets, because there's no particular reason why in Old Norse, knife should be masculine, tree should be neuter, and I'm looking around for something. Oh, aspen specifically is feminine, although tree in general is neuter. Mountain is neuter. So, and there's no reason for it, right? There's no they're not personified as masculine, feminine, or neither. It's just these categories emerge over a long period of time, probably originally from a distinction in Proto-Indo-European, the ancestor language 5,000 years ago, a distinction between animate and inanimate things. But what they considered animate versus inanimate may not make a lot of logical sense to us either. The inanimate things tended to become neuter in descendant languages, and then animate splits into masculine and feminine, partially because there's a feminizing suffix, a suffix that means I'm specifically talking about a woman version of this, right? I'm talking about the lady bear, the lady raven, or something, and that suffix also is abstractivizing and collectivizing, so that abstract nouns, reason, nation, things like that, tend to be feminine. But by the time you're learning, Old Norse from around 1200 or Ancient Greek from around 400 BC, there's no logical system behind what's masculine, feminine, and neuter. And in fact, in a language like Old English, almost no words for woman are feminine. So sometimes it's even worse than arbitrary. It's counterintuitive. All right. The genders, though, in ancient Indo-European languages, other than Hittite, where we still see animate and inanimate, but in the typical Indo-European language you're going to encounter, at the oldest level, we have masculine, feminine, and neuter. We have 3 genders. Now, in a lot of descendant languages, 2 of those are going to collapse together. In Swedish and Danish, masculine and feminine collapse together into something called common gender, at least in the standard languages. In the Romance languages, such as Spanish and French, the neuter and masculine have collapsed together into a masculine. It's still distinct from a feminine. So when there's just 2, typically it's because 2 of them have just reunified. Now, in a language that is 3 genders, 2 numbers, singular and plural, and then 4 to 8 cases, adjectives are going to have at least that many different forms, right? You're going to have a different form. I mean, I can just use Old Norse as an example. Black, just talking about bears again. Masculine singular nominative would be svartur, but feminine accusative plural would be svartar. So we find ourselves in a position where the same root word is being inflected in many, many different ways. And to an English speaker, this isn't necessarily intuitive at all. Like, why not just say why not just cut all that stuff off of the end and just say it one way? Well, that's what people speaking English did several hundred years ago. But a lot of languages haven't made the decision or hadn't made that decision by the time that we're interested in reading their texts. And besides, it's not that English doesn't code this. The price that English pays for losing all of these markers is that English has to observe a much stricter word order, right? I cannot say in English today, in this order, this doesn't make sense. Black, I see bear. Makes no sense. Like, maybe you could infer that I mean I see a black bear, but it just doesn't work. In Old Norse, I can say that. It's not very normal to say it, but I can, right? I can say Svartan seek bjorn. And you know Svartan has to go with Bjorn because there's a subject that's already marked ek, I, right? It's not Mick, me. And then, so all that's left as an object is Bjorn, and Svartan would agree with it as an accusative singular masculine. So we have the ability to separate words out in ways that English just does not abide. Is there a value to that? Well, languages aren't constructed logically, right? It's not like people get together and say, this is how we're going to do it. This is how we're going to mark plurals. This is how we're going to make sure that people know what we're talking about when we say I versus me. Languages just develop as these really almost unconscious extensions of a culture. People think about it a little bit, but they don't decide about it very much. And as far as what you might get out of that freer word order, one thing you get is a lot more possibilities with poetry, right? In English, if I want to get things to rhyme, I still have to put them in a particular order. In a language like Old Norse, when we have alliterative and rhyming poetry in the Skaldic tradition, I can put words kind of wherever the hell I want and get things to rhyme and alliterate that way. So some advantage to that, maybe, quote unquote, advantage. But I don't think, again, that languages seek advantage. They are pretty arbitrary. So I mentioned numbers, singular and plural, for nouns and adjectives. Nouns, by the way, I should have said this a long time ago. Nouns are person, place, or thing. It's the classic schoolyard definition. Still basically makes sense. It's, it is a thing. What are we talking about? A noun. Adjectives describe a noun. They describe its quality, it's good or it's bad. They describe its color, it's red, yellow, blue. They describe its texture, it's smooth, it's slimy, whatever, right? It's something that you can say if you can say the blank bee flew around the tree, the fast bee, the yellow bee, the American bee, whatever. Those are all adjectives. And adjectives have to agree with their nouns in inflecting languages. Now we also have pronouns. Pronouns can replace or I'm gonna use pronoun in a sort of older sense than a lot of people use today. They can replace or they can specify a noun. So there are personal pronouns. These are our words that reflect either ourselves, the people we're talking to, or someone else that we're talking about. I, me, you, he, she, it, they. Right? These refer to persons. Actually, it usually doesn't, but they refer to, this can stand for, it stands for something else though, right? I is not a description of anybody. I is just, when I'm saying it, when Jackson Crawford is saying it, it means Jackson Crawford. And when Lauren Crawford says it, it means Lauren Crawford. And when Gordon Breivik says it means Gordon Breivik, right? It's a stand-in for the speaker, just as he is a stand-in for any masculine subject that we might be talking about, right? Very contextually based. If I've just been talking about my friend Elaine, then the first time I say he after I've been talking about Delane, you probably understand that I'm talking about Delane. But these are all contextually based, and you can't pin down a definition that always applies in the same way you can pin down a definition of a noun. An aspen tree is a certain kind of tree. A man is a certain kind of human. A Ford is a particular kind of truck, right? Like those are nouns versus pronouns. We also have demonstrative pronouns, deictic pronouns, this, that, which have plurals, these, those. Now, in inflected languages, these also have to agree with a noun that they're describing or replacing. I have these. These has to be accusative plural, and it has to be the right gender. If I'm talking about books, which are feminine in Old Norse, I have to say I have these feminine accusative plural, right? But um, those trees growing over there, uh, tree is neuter in Old Norse, so I would need to use neuter nominative plural. So pronouns have to agree with the noun that they're either specifying or replacing. I would have to do the same thing, those trees, these books, or if I'm just talking about those and these, they take the gender of the referent that we have either stated or can infer that they refer to. We also have specifiers. I guess it's a somewhat newer term now. Um, Articles is a little bit older term. So an indefinite article, which is present in English, is an. It means we're just talking about some example of something. An aspen tree over there. Maybe I'm pointing way over there, and who knows which one I mean. But one, an aspen tree over there has my initials in it. Like I can't point it out to you. Just generally, there's one over there. A truck has passed by on the road. I don't know what truck. Just I know some truck. Right. I have an idea. I haven't told you yet what it is. Just there's an idea in my head. So it doesn't specify. In most Indo-European languages, historically speaking, this is considered an extremely unnecessary category. This is actually a fairly recent development in most Indo-European languages, including English, and usually develops from the word one, as it does in English. And is from a low-stress version of the word one. Same thing in Spanish, uno, una, un. And then we have the definite article, which is also not present at the earliest stage of most Indo-European languages, but many Indo-European languages develop it. I would say more develop it than don't, although there are still contemporary languages that don't have it. It's not inevitable to develop a definite article. And usually this will be formed from the word that. Our definite article, which specifies what we're talking about, the, is formed from a low-stress form of the word that in English. In the Scandinavian languages, it's a low-stress form of the same thing that becomes English yon, Y-O-N, like yonder, like, yonder tree. In Spanish, it's a low-stress form of ile, the Latin word that. So typically it's formed from a word for that, or, the whatever over there. And the definite article just specifies a particular one that we're talking about. The truck has been on the road, so I know which one. The aspen tree right here has, my initials in it or something. I don't actually do that. This is the first example that came to my mind. The microphone that I'm using, right, as opposed to another one that maybe doesn't work as well. I hope this one works because I've been talking for almost an hour. In many languages, Germanic and Slavic languages are the real, the ones I'm really talking about here. There is actually a difference in adjectives when you are using a definite article the or some other kind of specifier, demonstrative pronoun like this or that, or even often a possessive pronoun like my or your. And adjectives that are used with a specifier like that, something that specifies the one we're talking about, are weak. Adjectives that aren't used with such a specifier are strong. So in fact, in Old Norse, where we have this distinction, I see a black bear. Black is svartan, svartanbjorn. Masculine, accusative, singular, strong. I see the black bear, svarta. Masculine, singular, accusative, weak. So in a language like Old Norse, we have 3 genders, 2 numbers, 4 cases, and then strong versus weak. So that makes for 48 forms that an adjective can take, hypothetically. I mean, many of the forms are the same. You just have to use the right one, depending on, is it neuter dative plural versus is it feminine genitive singular. And although that strong weak distinction is not present in a language like Latin or Greek or Sanskrit, you still have about as many forms to learn because you have more cases. Well, you don't really in Greek, or I guess not so much in Latin either, but in Sanskrit, definitely you have a lot of cases to learn. Or in Russian or Czech. Okay. What else should we talk about here? Again, I may add to this uh, some other words that I use a lot in talking about language and grammar. Conjunction. A conjunction is going to join two words or two clauses. So, and is the classic conjunction. My wife and I are walking. Wife, I, both are subjects, both are nominative, both are the subjects of our walking, joined together by and. I see a black bear and an elk. So a black bear and an elk, those are both accusative, but they're joined by and. But we can also use and. It's a conjunction to join clauses. I see a bear and I'm thinking about you. I don't know. But then I see a bear is a clause joined to I'm thinking about you by that conjunction and. Another conjunction is or. Most of these don't give much trouble, right? You can typically, if you're learning Old Norse or Greek or what have you, you can say this is the word that means and, or this is a word that means or. The place where we can get a little bit caught as English speakers is subordinating conjunctions. And the subordinating conjunction in English really is that. We just don't use it very much anymore. So if you consider me saying in English, I say it's a good idea, it doesn't mean something different from I say that it's a good idea. Or I know it's true. That doesn't differ in meaning from I know that it's true. Or I see you've been here. It doesn't have any difference in meaning from I see that you've been here. But many languages do need a that there, right? So what's happened here is that at an earlier level, a verb like know or think or say or see, it needs an object. So we need to have some kind of stand-in object, even though there's not really just one single object there. The object is a clause, right? All right, let's say example. I see that you've been here. You've been here is a clause, right? We have a perfective verb. Subject is you. Here clarifies what we're talking about. It's an adverb. So you've been here. That's a clause. I see that. Now that can mean, like I can say that in this order, right? You've been here. I see that. That referring back to you've been here. But in English, as in so many other languages, we can actually use that whole clause, you've been here, as the object of a verb see. I see you've been here. But there's a, not that languages have to inevitably go through this transition, but there's a transitional phase in English where it was required that you say, I see that you've been here. We have kind of a dummy object that before we get to the clause that's actually what we're talking about that we've seen. Now, most Indo-European languages do require that subordinated conjunction, that equivalent of that, right? In Old Norse, it's at. So, exe at thu ert her. I see that you are here. I can't just say exe thu ert her. I have to have that dummy word, which originally is probably a pronoun. This has gotten kind of fossilized in the use of jumping from our main clause to the clause that is the object of the verb in the main clause. Sort of simplistic way of looking at it, but might help kind of historically clarify what's going on with it. Prepositions, I mentioned before, mostly these come up with nouns because typically they will have an object. They don't absolutely have to have a stated object, especially in a language like Old Norse. But again, anything that fills in that blank, I see, or the bee flies blank the tree, around the tree, under the tree, in the tree. Just remember that in an inflected language, typically in the dictionary of an inflected language like Latin or Greek or Old Norse or Modern Icelandic, you're going to see after that, in the entry on the dictionary for the preposition, you're going to see after the preposition the case it takes. So, for example, in Old Norse, you would see, if you looked up under, you would see that the preposition is undir, obviously a cognate word, and you would see that it takes a dative object if something is stationary under something. So, the earth is under the tree, so tree is dative. But the mole tunnels under the tree, we would see that that's an accusative, so tree would be accusative there. So sometimes the case that a preposition takes actually indicates a little bit of difference in what's going on with the verb too. That's a word that I just used now. Cognate is a word that may be relevant in this discussion. Cognate is a word that's ascended from the same ancestor word. So English under and Old Norse undir come from the same word in their ancestor language, Proto-Germanic. Those are fairly obvious cognates. Less obvious cognates would be English father and Latin pater. What we have is a regular change that's happened in English from P to F that hasn't happened in Latin, and T to Th, which hasn't happened in Latin. Now we borrow words from Latin that have the Latin form of that, paternal, paternity, but our native English word is a cognate, is a descendant by natural speech, not by borrowing words from another language from the same ancestor word. Often the word cognate is misused by non-linguists. They'll say something like, I don't know, Spanish residencia is cognate with English residence, and it isn't technically, because it's not like there was a word composed of that exact compound structure in Proto-Indo-European that developed through Latin into Spanish and through Proto-Germanic and Old English into English. It's that this word was formed in Latin, either reborrowed into Spanish or directly descended into Spanish, and borrowed into English. We've borrowed the same thing. That's not a cognate. A cognate has to be actually naturally passed down through speech. Versus a borrowing is a word that is consciously, at some level, taken from one language into another. So a lot of English speakers say amigo, right? That's a borrowing. That's not a cognate when people say amigo. All right. That's about an hour of linguistics terminology. I hope that at least listening to this, looking at the mountains, gives you some appreciation of some of this terminology and how it's used in English to talk about both English and other languages. And I hope that you see that in a language like English that doesn't have a distinction between dative and accusative, that we can still talk about dative and accusative, for example, right? I give you gifts. Gifts is still accusative. It's still a direct object. You is still dative. It's still an indirect object. We just don't mark it. So if we can think about how these concepts apply to the language that we already know, we can be ready for languages that express those same concepts differently. And with that, let me thank my Patreon supporters, thank the people who have taken my Old Norse class over the last year, and for beautiful Colorado, let me wish you all the best.